I mentioned just before the news headlines, cladding and schools. Dozens of schools have been built using combustible insulation since the material was banned on high-rise apartment blocks after the Grenfell Tower disaster. Obviously fears for the safety of people in schools, children and teachers and other staff alike. Let's talk about this with Dr. Jonathan Evans, who is a cladding expert. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Does the nature of a school building versus a high-rise mean this is less of a concern than it sounds?
Well, it certainly does to the government. There is a very different view of the risks posed by schools compared to residential buildings. They have different evacuation policies. You know, they have regular evacuation drills and so on. So the argument is that they have a different risk profile, which requires different guidelines on their construction.
We've also had, from the Department of Education last Thursday, new fire safety proposals for school buildings. This is where this emerged, that will continue to allow this kind of cladding. Do you think there is a meaningful difference between how schools are typically, insulated against fire versus a domestic dwelling?
I think they pose a very different problem, but my argument has been for a long time that it's so easy, frankly, to achieve really good steps forward in safety by using less combustible materials and non-combustible materials and so on, that actually there's no real argument that you shouldn't impose the same restrictions on schools that you do on high-rise buildings. They're still complicated situations. Arguably as well, you have all sorts of different issues as well. So, for instance, the idea that you can evacuate the building places a lot of responsibility on the teachers. So if I was the teachers' unions and so on, I'd be encouraging them to say, look, we really don't want the responsibility of trying to evacuate 30 children from a smoke-filled school in a panic situation. There's also issues, for instance, with the Disabilities Act. The Grenfell inquiry has highlighted, for instance, I think 40% of the people that died in Grenfell were disabled. Well, what happens if you have a disabled teacher? You know, can you be confident, or can they be confident of evacuating 30 panicked children in a fire situation?
Can I ask what the appeal of this cladding is? Is it cost?
The government's general tendency is to put as few restrictions as possible, and it will only introduce these if there's evidence to do so. So these guidance documents are a result of a two-stage process, where there's a call for evidence and then there's a proposed consultation document. Now, the call for evidence, which happened in 2019, did suggest that sprinklers particularly were going to be mandatory regardless of the height of the building, and that there would be restrictions on the external wall. But that somehow has changed. But the government doesn't put out consultations or calls for reasonable arguments for why this could go seriously wrong. So by definition, they're almost asking for evidence of what has gone wrong in the past, and it will continue to avoid restricting the designs of buildings until something goes really wrong. So, obviously, before Grenfell, we'd never had a serious fire, a fatal fire with ACM cladding material. And it seems that until you do, then the government doesn't act. So with the school proposal at the moment, there's absolutely no limitation on the insulation that you can use on a school at all below 18 metres. And there's very little restriction on the cladding material as well. But there are loopholes in the cladding legislation and the testing and classification process that we have for building materials at the moment. So I did a post a couple of days ago to sum it up that basically you could have potentially a 5-storey school with polystyrene insulation, polycarbonate thermoplastic cladding on a school without sprinklers under the proposed guidance. And it's really infuriated the industry, which is being lectured at morally by the government that it needs to improve, it needs to drive standards higher.
And yet this kind of thing is allowed.
Exactly, and they come out with a document that says, well, actually, we're pretty happy with the way it is, can't continue as you are. So, and it's a real problem for new regulators as well, because the regulator can only regulate very strongly on the basis of what the published guidance is by the government, even though it's not statutory. If the designers turn around and say, well, the government thinks that this is okay for a school, therefore why should you enforce anything that's more strict?
Thank you, John. Thanks, Dr. Jonathan Evans, cladding expert.